Like Miles Davis. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Enoch Pratt Free Library. My name is Vivian Fisher, and I am one of the deputy chiefs here at the Pratt Library State Library Resource Center, located at the Central Library. This afternoon, we are pleased to have Cheryl Head at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. But before I begin my introduction, I would like to remind you that we have many outstanding programs at the Pratt. So please pick up your copy of the beautiful Compass newsletter or go to our website, prattlibrary.org, for future programs. Cheryl Head is an author and former television producer, organizer, and broadcast executive. She is the author of the award-winning Charlie Mack Motown Mysteries. Head is an Anthony Awards nominee, a two-time Lambda Literary Award finalist, a three-time Next Generation Indie Book Award finalist, and winner of the Golden Crown Literary Society's Anne Bannon Popular Choice Award. This evening, or this afternoon rather, she will discuss her latest work, Time's Undoing. Please join me in welcoming Cheryl A. Head to the Pratt Library.
Hello. Thanks, Vivian, for that nice introduction. I didn't hear it all, but I appreciate it. Thank you guys for coming out. This has kind of been a rough week, so it's nice to be with like-minded people who are readers and people who believe in story and people who believe in libraries, and so it's good to see you. A couple of days ago, I was in the fetal position at my house, but today I had to put on some clothes and come in, so good to see you. Here's what's going to happen today. So I have a little PowerPoint. I think it's about 20 minutes, and then I'm going to do a reading about 10 minutes, and then I want to open it up for Q&A, and I hope you have questions or comments. I love taking comments and questions from the audience. So let's get started. Time's Undoing is fiction, but it's based on the true story of the murder of my grandfather in 1929 in Jim Crow, Alabama, at the hands of Birmingham, Alabama police. The story had been kept alive in my family for decades, but I did not have a lot of information about the story because in 1929, when Black people went against the police or the police were interested in them or they were involved in any way, got the attention of the Klan, they didn't do a lot of talking about it. So in my family, my mother's family, she often heard the story of her grandfather, but also almost always in furtive conversations and in whispers. Later, as my mother got older and we grew up, we would hear about my grandfather from her and my grandmother at holiday parties, at dinners and that kind of thing, trying to keep his memory alive. My brother is named after my grandfather, but we still didn't know much about the detail of his death. My mom and I talked a lot of times about whether the story should be written. She thought at one point she'd write the story. And then when I became a broadcaster and a writer, she thought I should write the story. But I always felt we didn't have enough information to really do a credible story about his passing. And then things changed because George Floyd was killed in May of 2020. And the following day, I started writing this story about my grandfather's passing. I started in rage. I mean, I literally remember walking through the house back and forth and kind of like screaming and, the kind of thing. But once I got started, I wrote every day for a year on that story. I couldn't reconcile how Black men going about their lives were still the victims of indiscriminate police violence, the way it had happened with my grandfather. We were different than 1929, I kept saying to myself. We had the civil rights movement. We codified rights for Black Americans. We elected Barack Obama, and yet in 2020, we're still struggling with social justice, and there was no guarantee for Black Americans. So I wanted my grandfather's story to point out the similarities and the differences between our modern era and the Jim Crow era in policing. And I wanted young people to know that Black Lives Matter was not some unique moment in time, that there were people before who faced these tribulations and communities before who faced these issues. So I began writing the story, looking at this picture every day. This is the one and only picture my family has of my grandfather. This was taken on his wedding day. He was 25 years old on his wedding day. My grandmother was not even 17 yet. So this is back in the day when you could marry young women. She was one of 13 children in her family. And so, you got the kids married off as soon as you could, because that way they could go someplace and get fed, I'll say one note about my mother's complexion here. She actually was lighter than she appears in this photograph, and she had gray eyes. I remember as a child being kind of mesmerized by her eyes. She lived in Florida, we lived in Detroit, but every summer she would come to visit us at the house. And I remember just thinking, who is this woman who looks so different than the rest of us, And I point this out only because there was speculation over the years that perhaps my grandmother, who could have passed for white in some instances, was the cause of my grandfather's death. Certainly his mother thought so. And actually, after his death, his mother went back to St. Pete, packed up her house, and left town. And my mother never had any more interaction with her in her life. I still can't find my grandmother. I've used Ancestry.com looking for her, looking for my grandfather's mother, and I can't find her. She literally disappeared. Again, this is the Jim Crow era in the South, and people didn't want the attention of the police and not the attention of the Klan. And sometimes the Klan and the police were one and the same. So at any rate, I kept this picture in front of me every day for inspiration, and it really did help me. I asked the book designers at Dutton, I might need your help on this, Sean, if you would, with the pointer, if they would incorporate the image from the wedding photo in the cover. And so, Sean, just to the left of a novel, if you could kind of circle, you see that face that's there? Okay. That's the image of my grandfather that was in the photograph. My mother and grandmother had always described him as a haughty man. They said that he was cocky. He was a carpenter. He had mad skills as a carpenter, but was cocky about it. Liked to dress well, liked to buy a new car every year. My mother once told me that people said he was too proud for his own good. The Times Undoing is structured in two timelines with two protagonists. The historical timeline of 1929 in the voice of Robert Harrington, as he describes his life in Birmingham and the few months he was there before he died, his interactions with his friends and enemies, and his untimely death. The second timeline is around the contemporary investigation of a young newspaper journalist, a Black journalist, Meghan McKenzie, who covers the Black Lives Matter movement in Detroit and who is also Robert's great-granddaughter in the book. The novel follows Meghan's efforts to unravel the mystery of her ancestors' murder, and along the way she meets people who support her search for the truth, and also others who, at all costs, want to keep the secrets of Birmingham's past buried. So my grandfather went to Birmingham a couple of months before he brought his wife and child. Robert had moved from St. Pete, Florida during Birmingham's boom time. They were known as the Pittsburgh of the South and Magic City because they were manufacturing steel and iron. I imagine Robert and my grandmother arriving full of excitement because Birmingham was a much bigger town than St. Petersburg, Florida. And my grandmother, I was told, had never really been out of her hometown before she came to Birmingham. Robert went to Birmingham to work around the construction that was happening for the people who were the leaders and the owners of the steel town. They were making ornate, beautiful mansions, and his skills as a carver and a carpenter were needed. But when they got to Birmingham, they were, excited. Birmingham did have Black codes. These were really draconian laws that prescribed how Black people could live, how they could interact with white people. And there were lots of segregated communities, but there were also these communities and these neighborhoods that were thriving business places filled with camaraderie and enterprise and music and entertainment and self-sufficiency. So imagine Can you advance that for me? Oops. Can you advance that? Well, imagine them arriving in this car. So Grandpa bought a new car every year. So this is the 1929 Franklin Victoria sedan. So here comes this haughty black man with this light lady sitting next to him in this fancy car. So I'm sure he got the attention of both black folks and white folks in Birmingham. So I was writing every day for about a year and taking time in the evening after 3 or 4 hours of writing in the morning to do research. Most of it was pretty grueling research, looking through maps, books, listening to podcasts about Birmingham and its history. I signed up for ancestry.com. I'd not done that before, but I wanted to see if I could find out more information about my grandfather. I looked through census data and city directories and ancestry.com and that platform, and birth records and death records. Ancestry.com had a relationship with newspapers.com. I think it still does. And so I subscribed to that as well. And that became my most useful source of materials in my research, the digital archives of newspapers, and in particular, Black newspapers. So in the 1920s and 30s in Birmingham, they had about a dozen newspapers. I was really interested in that fact. Some of them were as small as bulletins, one-page bulletins, but others were daily papers. Some were weekly papers. These were the names of some of the papers. I love the fact that one of them is called the Birmingham Wide Awake because it kind of invokes the woke moniker that we think about now. I paid attention to the news stories in these papers, but I also paid attention to the want ads, the classifieds, the death notices. They had a sports section, they had an entertainment section, lots of advertisement for insurance and funeral homes. You could buy underwear for 50 cents and dresses for $1. Things like that really helped me to understand what Black life on a daily basis was like in Birmingham, Alabama. And I wanted to infuse the atmospherics and the processes of Black daily life into the novel, into those 1929 chapters. So I also got to look at some mainstream newspapers that were digitized. Spent hundreds of hours going through the pages of these papers, following leads, looking at keywords, and putting them into the search engines, putting Robert Harrington into the search engines. There were thousands of Robert Harringtons. That's a very common name in America and in Birmingham and in Alabama. And finally, it paid off. So I was sitting there one afternoon doing the grueling work of looking through the archives, and I found this article, 1-inch by 1-inch article that appeared in my grandfather's hometown, the St. Petersburg Times. It's now called the Tampa Bay Times. And there's an article there that talks about my grandfather's murder. That's Robert Harrington. They gave his address. And it was the first time in all those decades that I actually had proof that my mother's stories and my grandmother's stories weren't just mythology. They had talked about him, and I'm sure we believed him, but we really had no proof that he had died in Birmingham, nor that the police had killed him. But here's an article. Headline, local Negro killed by Birmingham officer. Bingo. I remember, just stopping the research at that point, just shutting down, staring at it. I remember crying. At first you can't believe it's happened. It's hundreds of papers I'd looked through. And then I thought about calling my mother, but then I decided I should wait and kind of figure out a way to tell her. So I called my brothers and sisters instead and told them. It was really a miraculous find. It provided details of my grandfather's death that we never had before. For instance, we had never known the actual date of his death. And through this article, I was able to find his death certificate because I had the date of his death. The article also says he resisted arrest. I thought, I wonder what resisting arrest by a Black man means in Jim Crow South. But most importantly, because I had the date of his death, I could get the death certificate. Now, I had to lie and say I was my mother to get that, but I did that. The death certificate was another great find, again, a document we hadn't had for 90 years. The details of his death are in that certificate. Some of it was really hard to read. Um, they said he was shot in the chest and abdomen by gunshots. It was 8:30 in the morning. My grandmother was listed as the informant, which means that she, a 19-year-old at this time, had to go to the police department and get in their face and say, "You killed my husband," and to report that death. That means she has some chops as a 19-year-old. This area, 4th Street West and Avenue F, is the area listed as the location of his murder. I visited a few years ago Birmingham and went to this site. It's an empty lot right now. It had been a service station. I can only imagine that maybe my grandfather stopped at the service station in his fancy car on his way to work. My mother said she had heard over and over that my grandmother said she and grandpa had a argument that morning. She had packed his lunch, but she hadn't given him a kiss that morning, and that always kind of stayed with her. We still don't know where my grandfather's buried. The death certificate lists a burial in St. Petersburg. By a funeral home I could not find any more information about. I'm still hoping, at some point we might be able to find that information. There's still new newspapers being digitized, so there could be a death notice about it. So I just got an email this week saying 500 more newspapers have been digitized in newspapers.com. So I'll just keep going back to the reservoir and see if I can get more information. This document here came to me from someone who wanted to help in the story. I got lots of help from people that I didn't know. I called a cemetery. I was looking online and doing the Google Maps and found an old cemetery, and I figured it was old enough that they might still have records. It was a black cemetery in a black neighborhood, and I called just out of the blue, and this older lady answered the phone, and I explained to her what I was doing, that I was looking to see if my grandfather might be buried in this cemetery in the old section. They had an old section. And she said, well, what's his name? And I gave her the name, and I told her the story, and she said, I'm going to see if I can help you. Now, I didn't hear from her for 2 weeks, and I didn't call back, but 2 weeks later, she called me back. And she said, honey, I couldn't find anything about your grandfather. And I remember thanking her and imagining her creeping to the old section of the cemetery and going down in that dungeon, that I'm sure it looked like a dungeon, and going through these papers to see if she could find his name. This is what you see here is a police incident card given to me by another person who wanted to help. He was the head of the archives at the Birmingham Public Library, Mr. Baggett. He's retired now. He retrieved this card and several others from the basement of the Birmingham Central Police Department. They did a refurbishment. They tore up the basement. He found these cards. He grabbed them and took them back to the library and digitized them. These cards were called in a podcast I found about Jefferson County, that's where Birmingham resides, their police shootings, which were 300 or 400 over about a 30-year period. Doesn't sound like a lot. Most of these cards were called kill cards at that point. 80 or 90% of them Black men and women. Many of them, like this one, resisting arrest. He looked through his archives, as did another person, Margaret Burnham, who's at Northeastern University and heads the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project. She got hold of these cards because she was writing a book about the justice system in Jim Crow South, and she was focusing on Birmingham. I called her out of the blue. She was the dean of the law school at the time, and I left a message, and she called me back, and she said, I want to help you. Let me see if my researchers have any card with your grandfather's name on it, or if we have any interviews that talks about your grandfather. They did not. Their records dated back to only to 1930. They did not have 1929. But I want to make the point that there were so many people who just hearing about the story wanted to help me. I remember when I was shopping the book out for publishing, there was an editor, a white male editor in New York, and he said, we've read the book, but I just don't believe all those people would try to help this young woman try to get this information about her grandfather. And I said to him, how do you think Black people survived in this country? Lots of people gave us help, mostly Black people helping other Black people. Yes, this happened all the time. And this, for me, was proof, even in this day and age, that people want the truth to be out and they want to help in telling the story. So we published this book in 2023, and I'm really grateful for the opportunities I had to talk to booksellers and book clubs and book festival attendees and readers around the country about Time's Undoing. I was in 12 states for book events and a panelist at 6 book festivals. I received scores of media reviews, and Time's Undoing was named on 4 bestseller lists. And it was a fantastic year of whirlwind activity. Very gratified by that. Also, gratified by the nominations that the book has received. Received about 9 book award nominations and other kinds of acknowledgments. All that's lovely, it's all great. I received a nice advance to write the book, so there were people who believed in this story and thought this story had resonance. But I have to say I'm most gratified by this, that my mother, who was 95 at the time, who is now 97 years old, feisty and living in St. Petersburg, Florida, could witness the reception for Time's Undoing. Her eyesight's not so great, so she couldn't read the book, but she and I sat and listened to the audiobook, some of the chapters of the audiobook the first time, and it was fascinating to watch her listen, because she was mesmerized by the voice. And then I remembered, well, she hadn't heard her father's voice for 90 years, 97 years. And she must be imagining that that's how he sounded. So she was just, for the first time in ages, just silent and still as she listened to the audiobook. She and I would talk every day when I was writing the book. I'd ask her questions. Her memory, she was 2 years old when her father was killed. So her memory wasn't great about that. She told me everything she had heard about him. She had a couple epiphanies in our conversations going back and forth. I remember such and such, she would say. And then finally, I would start writing in the morning, and she'd call me and she said, "Are you writing a book?" And I'd say, "Yes, Mom." "You want to read me a little bit?" And I would say, "Yes, Mom." So she kind of became my co-writer as we went through the process. So I would say that I'm most grateful that Mom got to see the story of her father's death, at least fictionalized, but brought to light. So end of PowerPoint. I'm going to do a reading for you. I think I'm going to do 2 sections. 10 minutes seems like a really long time to me when I'm doing readings, but I found a section that I think works well. So if you will bear with me. And then I want to read one section from one reading from the 2019 chapters. So the book is structured so that we're going back and forth in time from 1929 to 2019. In the 1929 sections, I have headings. It's a way to keep the reader kind of organized in the flow of the story. This section I'm going to read first from 2019 is from Meghan's perspective. She is doing the grueling work of trying to suss out clues about the murder of her grandfather. It's really boring work. It's a couple times when I was doing my newspaper archives and she was doing her newspaper research, I thought, wow, we're in a parallel universe here doing the same thing. It doesn't always make for a lot of action in the first part of the book, as she's going into people's basements and looking through old newspapers and she's interviewing people. But this is a section where she has made it one of her phone calls to someone she thinks can give her information about her grandfather's death, even though it's 90 years ago. And she's also set up an appointment to visit with the local leader of the Black Lives Matter chapter in Birmingham, about 10 minutes. At 11:30, my phone vibrates and the caller ID shows a Gardendale number. The last copy has fallen into the catch bin of the printer, and I swoop up the papers and connect the call as I return to Carol, and closed the door. Meghan McKenzie, I say into the receiver. You left a message for me? The woman says tentatively. She sounds white, Southern, and wary. Yes, ma'am. I'm a reporter with the Detroit Free Press. I was wondering if the former chief of police, Mr. Pruitt, might be able to talk to me a few minutes about a case I read about in one of the local newspapers. It's an incident where, unfortunately, a Birmingham officer was killed. What newspaper? The woman asks suspiciously. The Independent. It's a small lie. I've come across the Birmingham Independent during my research. It's touted as a conservative publication and had a good run in the years following the spark of civil rights activity in the city. There's silence at the other end of the line. I wait. Daddy's advice to me was if I'm talking to Southerners of a certain age, I should give them time to digest information. Don't rush people, he said. If you ask someone a question, give them room to think. 13 seconds tick by on my watch. It feels more like 13 minutes. The Independent, that was a good paper in its day. The lady speaks louder than before, like someone's listening in the background. Yes, ma'am, so I've heard. What kind of story are you writing? I'm doing research on how dangerous policing can be. Ah, ain't that the truth? A voice chimes in from an echoey background. I must be on speakerphone. Daddy really don't take many visitors, the woman says. He's in a nursing home, you know. He don't get around too good no more. Well, if it's no trouble, maybe I can arrange to speak with him by phone. Just 10 or 15 minutes is all I need. Well, sometimes my grandson visits Daddy, and when he's there, we do that Zoom thing, you know, where you can see each other. Yes, Zoom. I use it all the time. Well, give me a number. He could call you tomorrow morning. I'd appreciate it, ma'am. That's more of Daddy's advice. Address older folks as sir and ma'am. Include the word appreciate, along with phrases like, thank you kindly, and if it's no trouble. In other words, speak like Laura Ingalls in Little House on the Prairie. By the way, ma'am, who am I speaking to? I'm his daughter, Velda. Thank you kindly. I disconnect and slump in my chair, exhausted by the interaction, choosing my words carefully, tiptoeing around the truth, letting silence unfold. It's hard work. I stand, stretch, and open my cubbyhole door to get some air flowing. Persuading and making nice on the phone is something I've done numerous times. It's a tactic reporters use to gain the cooperation of a reluctant witness or information source. But this time, as I cajoled and yes ma'amed, I was distracted by my angry thoughts of centuries-old conversations in the Deep South, where Black people literally had to bargain and plead for their lives. My phone alarm reminds me of an appointment with Monique, and I gather up folders and notes and stuff them into my backpack. I program the address Monique has sent into my Maps app, and I'm on my way. In just a 10-minute drive from downtown to Birmingham's inner city, the economic disparities of the haves and have-nots are dramatically revealed. I grew up in one of Detroit's nearby suburbs where Black people raise their children in homes with manicured lawns, summer camps, and college funds. But Detroit still has scores of neighborhoods like this one, with abandoned buildings, overgrown lots where houses once stood in blocks where poverty and despair cling like sweat on dark skin. I'm meeting Monique at the church that serves as the local headquarters for BLM. I enter through the basement and follow the security guard. I see 24 volunteers making preparations for an upcoming rally. They're mapping out a march route, lettering placards, and practicing protest chants. We pass a table stacked with flyers and posters ready to be distributed throughout the city. Upstairs, on the choir stage, Monique is concluding a training. She has a commanding presence and a warm energy. I'm 5'8", she's taller, maybe 10 pounds heavier, with a head of long, beautiful twists. My curly hair, inherited from my mother, doesn't braid well, and I'm always envious of sisters with locks, twists, or braids. Today, Monique wears a BLM tee, leggings, and boots. The others are similarly attired, and I feel conspicuously overdressed in my tunic top, slacks, and flats. I met Monique the year after she and a group of Samford University students had made a 6-hour drive from Birmingham to Baton Rouge to protest the police killing of 37-year-old Alton Sterling. Later that year, she dropped out of school to commit herself to the Black Lives Matter cause. She's been trained in civil disobedience practices and is now passing on her knowledge to others. You'll be confronted by police, outside agitators, and sometimes right-wingers looking to do us harm. The key is to stay calm and unified, Monique says to the volunteers. We have a right to peacefully protest, but the moment there's violence, the police can and will move in. It's critical for us to focus on what's important. We're exercising our constitutional rights, our First Amendment rights of peaceful protest against police brutality and racial injustice. That's what I keep in mind whenever someone tries to bait me. What if someone hits me or throws something at me, a 20-something white kid with freckle asks? I'm not just gonna stand by if someone takes a punch at me or one of my friends. There are murmurs of agreement and heads nod in the group gathered around Monique. She grabs a folding chair from the side and pulls it close to sit among the trainees. Look, I'm not going to tell you not to defend yourself if you feel your life is in danger, but most of the time that won't be the case. Remember, you're not out there alone. If someone starts shoving or pushing, our protocol is to tighten our ranks. Most of these bullies who try to incite violence will back down if a group confronts their actions. It's the same for people who loot. Those folks are opportunists, not activists. I'm not marching for free sneakers, and I'm sure none of you are either. The trainees nod and a few applaud. Monique spots me in the back of the sanctuary and hands off her clipboard to one of her associates. When she joins me, I extend a hand. She brushes it away and pulls me into a hug. So those are your new volunteers. Just one group of them. We get 30 or 40 new people every month. Our contributions are way up too. It's amazing how many people want to be engaged in this movement right now. So should we sit and talk or get started on our tour, I ask. Let's drive. I've been cooped up inside all morning. You picked the best time of the year to come to our neck of the woods. Fall is really beautiful in Birmingham, and it's not so ungodly humid. We take my car, and Monique is right about the season. The trees on the distant red mountain haven't changed yet, but there are yellow root, climbing hydrangea, and purple blooms, which Monique tells me are Stokes aster. She's also right that this neighborhood, despite the flora, will never make it into the Chamber of Commerce promotional brochure. As we travel block after block, we fall into a comfortable silence. I sense Monique looking at me, gauging my reaction to the blight and impoverishment, but I'm concentrating on driving. On the very busy main streets, I can only take in a broad sweep of my surroundings, but as we pass through residential areas, I get a good look at houses, people, and living conditions. What do you think? Monique asks. Well, it's a lot different from downtown. Yep. But isn't Birmingham going through a growth spurt? The university is expanding and there's generating other development, right? You've been reading the newspapers. I laugh. Actually, I've been reading a shitload of newspapers. That's what I've spent most of my time on since I got here. You ready to do the interview? We can stop at a fast food place and grab a burger or something. Have you had a meat and three yet? Ooh, no, not yet. Oh, then I know the place to take you. And this time of the day, we can sit and talk and nobody will hassle us. Nikki's West, I learned, is a wildly popular restaurant. The eatery has a semi-nautical theme. A cobblestone wall adorned with shark sculptures flanks a small fireplace. Tables and chairs are polished to a sheen that matches the wood paneling, and booths are both roomy and comfortable. Folks queued at the buffet bar are jovial, excited like they're in line to see a Beyonce concert. It's crowded. I don't know how long they'll take to let us in. No worries, it's a big place and a lot of people are getting carryouts. A gracious host sits us at one of the corner booths when Monique informs her we want to sit a while. We drop sweaters and bags in our seats and we line up. We make small talk and I aim my writer's eye at the people and the environs. When we return to the table, we find napkins and a pitcher of sweet tea. Condiments, including Tabasco, steak sauce, and relish, are clustered on the table along with pats of butter, salt, pepper, and sugar. The head buzz I get as soon as I swallow the tea tells me I won't need the sugar. My tray has 2 plates filled with fried shrimp, macaroni and cheese, broccoli, and fried okra. I skipped lunch today, so I'm counting this meal as an early dinner, and it's just what the doctor ordered. I admire Monique's food choices for a few seconds: beef tips with rice, collards, and black-eyed peas, then dive into my food. Monique is a 4th-generation Birmingham resident, nimble with details about the city, its residents, and their relationships. She knows all about the history of the restaurant and the neighborhoods we've traversed in the last couple of hours, explaining that many of the communities were their own cities before being annexed in the heyday of the steel industry. Those neighborhoods were thriving, but when the mills started closing, they began to change. That's code for whites moving out, she says. I nod. It happened in Detroit too, after the rebellion of '67. So you know, it makes me so angry when people try to diminish the value of Black Lives Matter with the false argument that more Black people were shot by other Black people than the police. It's a simplistic deflection that ignores decades of poverty and disenfranchisement, Monique says with passion. Sorry, I get worked up about this stuff. Anger isn't great for digestion. You sound just like my mother, I say with a smile. Then she sounds like mine. We laugh in tribute to Black mothers and to keep the rage at bay. Thanks. Looking at time, so I'm going to read just a very short section from the 1929. This is maybe 2 minutes, 2.5 maybe. It's chapter 11, titled Tradesman, 1929. My job at the mansion goes well. Some days there are as many as 30 men, Black and white, doing various jobs on the inside and outside of the structure. Work continues on preparing the ground for a massive wrought iron fence. It's back-bending work. Toiling in the midday heat is almost unbearable, so the digging crews begin just before daylight. When I arrive, an hour later, the laborers in the trench are already covered in a fine dust, and they pause in their digging to stare at me in my car. Most have smiles, a few glare with envy. One man tips his hat. The white workers are not so generous. I park my car near the other vehicles, mostly trucks. The carpentry crew gathers near a pile of lumber at the side of the house, waiting for the supervisor's orders for the day. 3 white laborers are mixing cement for a large courtyard at the rear of the mansion. As I walk by, one of the men shouts out, "Uppity nigger." It's a lesson of survival for the Negro race to ignore these insults. Old Black men have been the most vocal teachers. Their very existence gives them credentials. I pause a second, but keep walking until something splatters at my feet. I look down at my boots. One is covered in wet cement. I swivel to see the thrower, a scrawny, pock-faced man wearing a tilted denim cap that doesn't conceal the scar on his forehead. We stare at each other. He wears raveling coveralls and scuffed brown boots. His arms are unusually long, his fingers stretching beyond his knees. He reaches toward his back pocket. I twitch. My revolver is in my lunchbox. The man pulls out a dirty rag and rubs at the cement mixture on his hand. I'm weighing my odds at successfully tackling the long-armed man without involving his friends in the fight when Pete, one of my white co-workers, appears at my side. "Harrington, the supervisor's here," he says loudly, then whispers in my ear, "You don't want to find dry cement on the Franklin at the end of your shift." I return to the car and park it on the other side of the work site. "Thanks," I say to Pete as we move inside the mansion to begin our shift. "That's a beautiful automobile. I'd hate to see anything happen to her." I nod. "You ever think of selling her?" he asks. I stare at him. He's not bad for a white guy, and he's an excellent carpenter. He's older than me, and I've learned a few things from him, and vice versa. Lately, I've been thinking of maybe getting more of a family car. I have another baby on the way. "Well, if you decide to sell her, let me know," Pete says, looking back at the Franklin. "She's a real beauty, all right." I've been told by white men that I have a way with wood. I know it sticks in the craw of some of them to admit it, but I already know it's true. Papa Tico saw it in me as a young boy when I would join him in whittling. He learned to carve in Haiti, where he freed sugarcane of its hull to reveal the succulent pulp. Under his watchful eye, he made crosses, animals, and tiny replicas of him and Mama from the chunks of pine I'd find behind our Georgia cabin. Over the years, I learned to make magic with fresh-cut wood, a cut here, a nick there, sanding with the rough surface of discarded bark, smoothing with my fingertips, at first pale like the skin of a white baby, then eventually, as air and handling breathes life, form and function into it, glowing with natural color. My job on the interior of this Birmingham mansion is custom carpentry work on an ornate stairwell that will join the upper floor of the residence to a grand ballroom on the first level. The main construction crew had roughed in the stairs even before I arrived in the city, but the detail work requires my kind of skills. Though I have not personally seen one, I'm told these types of sweeping staircases are staples in the most elegant of wealthy homes. Built from a gorgeous oak, the steps will be stained and carpeted, and each step will have an etched border. Last month, my teammate and I carved and assembled the balusters, spindles, newel posts, and fittings. The banister will have 12 posts and 60 spindles, though we made extras of each in case they become damaged during the installation. At a temporary workbench, we sit outside for hours at a time with our chisels, strap clamps, bevels, and glue. Each banister post will have a finial shaped like a lion's head and have drawn with pencil on wax paper a design for the finished product. I'll personally handle that delicate carving work. We're about halfway through the stair assembly with another 3 weeks of work ahead of us before we begin the final tasks, engraving the borders of each step and etching the elaborate curlicues on the handrails and footrails. I put in a full day, and as I clean and gather my tools, I look up and notice the fellows mixing and pouring cement. Their work has brought them to my side of the mansion, where the ballroom will spill out onto an expensive patio. They watch as I load my tools into the trunk of the Franklin and start up the engine. When I drive past, Long Arms is leaning on his wood rake. He spits in the dirt as we lock eyes. Thank you. We are at 3:42, and I was told to leave 15 minutes for questions, so I'm only 3 minutes off, but I used to work in television, so I can do that. And Sean is waving at me. Oh. So,
Can you tell that we don't use these wireless mics that often? I knew you were in television. That's just too good, Cheryl. We have about 15 minutes for your questions. If you have a question, please direct it here or to the microphone over there. We have an audience that's watching online. That way they can hear the question. While folks are lining up with their questions.
While they're running up to the mics.
Yes, that is foreshadowing. I'll start with a question from the online audience. How is Meghan like you and not like you?
Meghan is young. I am not. Meghan is also fearless, and I have not been tested enough to know how fearless I am. As she goes through her investigation in Birmingham, she's thwarted, she's threatened, and her life is endangered. And she says in one line, she says, they are not dealing with the same Black people. So that's how I would say we're different.
My question is, why did you decide to go nonfiction instead of nonfiction?
Yeah, my mom and I talked about should it be memoir, but again, when I first started writing the book, I just did not have enough information, enough detail that I thought would make a credible memoir or even a credible like essay. I just didn't have enough information. Had I had the death certificate and that newspaper article and the things I found in Ancestry.com, I might have done something that was nonfiction, but I thought it was best to fictionalize it and to infuse it with as much information, in fact, as I had about my grandfather. I didn't want him to come across as a saint. I don't know if he carried a gun, but when my mom was describing him as haughty and proud and driving a new car, I thought, I bet he had a gun, so I put that into his character. Yeah, that's the answer.
Hi, Cheryl.
Hi, Tom.
So I love your book. I read it.
Thank you, Tom.
I have two questions, really. The first one is, how did writing this book change you? And it could be anything about the experience. And the second one is, how would Meghan have responded to what happened on Tuesday?
Wow, what questions? So Tom and I used to work together. I used to work for him. He owns a executive search firm here in Baltimore. And so I would drive into Baltimore every day on BWI for a couple of years. And I thought, wow, this is getting old. So Tom and I go way back. We worked together at the public television station in Washington, D.C., WETA. We were both senior vice presidents. The book changed me in a couple of different ways. I've written other books. I have a series called the Charlie Mack Motown Mysteries. It's 6 books in the series. It's a Black lesbian private eye who owns her own agency. And I love writing the character. I love writing that series. But it's a mystery series, and I write it very methodically, and I plot it. I'm a plotter. I have an outline. For this book, I was not a plotter. I did all my research on 1929. I really immersed myself in 1929 Birmingham, Alabama, America, reading all these newspapers. And then I set aside the research and just wrote the 1929 chapters organically. I'd never done that before. It was kind of scary, but I thought that was the best way for me to do it. I write my grandfather's death scene in this book, seen through his eyes. This is the only chapter in the book that I didn't write chronologically. I needed to have emotional heft to write that. that chapter, but it certainly has changed me as a writer. I think I'm bringing much more emotional intelligence to the work, kind of maybe allowing myself to be a little more vulnerable in my writing. I'm writing a Western now. I love Westerns, and I'm writing about a Black Pinkerton and a Black Secret Service agent in 1870 Oklahoma, who also time travel and go back and fix some shit that happened in the West. So I probably wouldn't have written that before this book. Meghan, you know, the book ends in a way where Meghan is a serious professional. She believes in her career. She's 28, like her grandfather was, great-grandfather was when he was killed. And she has the opportunity to just maybe set the career aside in this book and remain in Birmingham and build on some relationships she's building there. She has a slight romance there with this really cool guy in Birmingham. But she wants to go back and do the work that she's trained hard. She's got a J school degree, and she wants to be a real journalist. I wanted to make a point about journalists because I think in these days and times, journalists are standing in the chasm between crazy and civility. There's also an ally in this book, a white librarian. I think librarians are doing the same kind of righteous work. And so I'm always happy to be at libraries. I think Meghan would hunker down, get behind her keyboard and start writing the truth. The Washington Post might not do it, but I think Meghan would try to do it. I think she'd go to her editorial board and said, I need to talk about this. And I think we need to go back and look at Black Lives Matter some more. Apparently, people hate Black people still. So we need to write some more about that. I think that's what Meghan would do. Let's see, your second question was what? Oh, that was the second question? Oh, okay, you got both. Hey, good. Hi, Ben.
How you doing? I was
I'm
going to
good.
say thank you for coming to Baltimore.
Absolutely, happy to
And
be here.
I was going to ask you, a lot of us as African people, like we only know that our great grandparents or our ancestors were African slaves in this country, and just some of the avenues of research. What type of platforms would you recommend us use?
Mhm.
I know you mentioned ancestry.com, but any other platforms, any other insight that you can bestow upon us about researching our family history?
Okay, that was a great question. Ancestry.com is doing better. It didn't, when I was using it several years ago, have many records on Black people. There were records, military records, for instance, there were just Black military records that were in Washington, D.C. that burned in a fire during World War II. I mentioned that because I've written a book about Black soldiers in World War II. So it's not always easy to find them, but I tell you what, Black newspapers are your thing. And there are more and more of them being digitized now. I had no idea a place like Birmingham would have 12 independent Black newspapers. And it was the only way that Black people could keep in touch with the world, with their relatives, with the stories of the country that were relevant and important to them. They talked about racism in a way that the mainstream papers didn't. They talked about crime in the way the mainstream papers didn't. We didn't really see the lives of Black people unless they were notorious, and so they would do, all kinds of stories about who's visiting whom from what country, from what city, and who had a baby and who went to church. I mean, it was just uplifting to be able to read about Black people from a perspective that was a loving perspective and one that was not one that was a 30,000-foot look at our lives. We've got lots of great books now. I certainly recommend the 1619 Project. That's a great book. There are lots of books in the juvenile, how do you call that? The new age and the young adult books that are fabulous for our young people to read. I think you can find some great stories in fiction as well about our lives and about our communities and about what we can do together to make our country better and ourselves better. You're living at a time where finding information and getting information is not hard to do. All you have to do is seek it out. Your phone your phone is an entry to a lot of information. There's a lot of bad stuff out there too. Oh my God, there's a lot of bad stuff out there. And I would always recommend that if you're looking at publications, that you look at 2 or 3 of them to get various perspectives. That's when I look at news, which I'm not going to be doing a whole lot of in the next 4 years. But when I did look at news, I didn't go to just one source. And I was so grateful to be able to see the BBC and how they talked about our stories and our issues. When I lived in Detroit, I had access to the Canadian Broadcasting Company. I regularly listened to them because you're going to hear about America in a way that is different than the way we tell stories about ourselves here and the way our media tells stories about ourselves. I do think journalists still are standing in the chasm between crazy and civility, but I know we also have to pick and choose now what media we gravitate to, and be discerning. I love our Black newspapers, the one you have here, the one that's in Chicago, the one that's in Detroit. You know, support those newspapers and make them better.
Hi.
Hi. Hey, Arlie.
Hello. It's so wonderful to be here. I love Times Undoing.
Thank you.
Especially love the way you weave in the current life and 1929. And a question I had was, so you talk a lot in the current day about the Black Lives Matter movement,
Yeah.
and sort of the protests that happened after George Floyd's murder. And I'm wondering, in your research, did you see evidence of protest after your grandfather's murder, or just resilient, like pushing back
Yeah.
and fighting back
Yeah.
in smaller ways, or communication, or banding together? What kind of
Yeah.
What did you see or read about that?
That's a great question. No protests over my grandfather's death that I could find. I mean, I think he was not a famous Black man who got killed by police, and it was happening a lot, and it didn't like register beyond maybe his community. But in reading the Black newspapers, I saw lots of articles about protest. I saw lots of articles about protests even overseas, and thoughtful pieces, editorials and think pieces about Blacks in America and the Jim Crow South. The Klan was at its very height in 1929 in Birmingham, Alabama. But the Klan had also marched the year before in Washington, D.C., down Pennsylvania Avenue. It was beginning to be the target of Washington Congress people, and they were sort of on the run. But you know, it was a kind of a turbulent time, and Black people were aware of the turbulence, and if they had access to these Black newspapers, they could read from other perspectives what was happening around resilience and protests and that kind of thing. I spent some time in the chat rooms of hate groups, because I've written about hate groups and the nascent beginnings of hate groups in different cities, and it's amazing how you can go to these groups without a password and listen in to what they're saying. And that's the other thing I guess I would recommend to you, young man, in thinking about Black people, is to go and see what these hate groups are saying about Black people, Jewish people, Catholic people, LGBTQ people, out loud with no hesitation. Just like in Project 2025, it's in black and white. I've looked at it, I've read it, and it tells you what people are going to do. You know, they're no longer afraid and not hiding. Hope that answers.
Well, I can't wait to read the book.
Thank
But I
you.
want to respond to this young man's question here, because you're in the library,
Yeah.
and I don't know if you're from Baltimore, but here we do a lot of genealogy programs. And one of the sites that you also can use is familysearch.org, which is the Mormon site. The Mormons are
the Mormon site.
experts.
That's
Yes,
right.
the experts in tracing your genealogy. And sometimes, while Ancestry has gotten a lot from them, and I think they were supposed to have some kind of merger or something with them with Ancestry, but familysearch.org is free.
Awesome.
And also, if you here do not have a Pratt Library card, we have numerous databases. We have the newspapers. We have a wealth of information here for you to do genealogy. And we have a number of departments, African American, Maryland Department, and periodicals, and social science and history. You can go to any one of those departments and they can help you begin your genealogical research. So that's my plug for the library.
I don't blame you. Yay, yay libraries. Thanks, library.
But I do want to say thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. I can't wait to read the book because I love historical novels, historical fiction specifically. And Mrs. Hurd will be signing books out in the hallway, so please go out and buy your copies of the book. And we thank you so much for this great presentation.
you.
And I love the documents that you have because as a historian, you know, we love documents.
I know you do.
We love primary source materials. So again, thank you. And let's give her a warm applause for the great
Thank
work
you,
that she's done.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
I get so much joy out of serving